It's good to see all of you. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about Lenape relationships with plants and some of the work that we have been doing over the last year. But first, I always want to ground us in just a very brief history and geography of Lenape hooking so that for those who are unfamiliar with this history, that we're all on the same page. And so I want to highlight that pre-colonial Lenape hooking was not one singular political nation, but rather a collection of many different communities who were connected by their shared territory, by kinship, by language, politics, and culture. And so I have images here on the left. We have the pre-colonial Lenape territory that's shaded in green that is centered around the Lenape Sipu, or the Delaware River, and her tributaries. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, I have the pre-colonial Nanticoke territory, which is clustered around the Nanticoke River and her tributaries, the river being named after our people. The word Nanticoke means people of the tidewater, and we trace our ancient ancestry to the Lenape, so we consider the Lenape to be the grandfathers of our communities. And first contact was very early, since we are a coastal people. The Muncie Lenape communities encountered Verrazano in 1524, and that's the same Verrazano they named the bridge after in New York. Now the Nanticokes met John Smith when he rode up our river in 1608, and that is the same John Smith from Pocahontas fame, because you can see where we are geographically. The Powhatan communities were just our neighbors to the south. By the late to late 1700s, the relations between the colonizers and our communities had completely deteriorated, and many Nanticoke and Lenape people were forced out of their homelands. These arrows are broadly showing the paths that many of our people took. You can see they are headed north and west, and today they've been pushed into Oklahoma, into Wisconsin, and into Ontario. However, not everyone left the homelands, and those who stayed carved out a resilient experience and existence in the edges of the ever-expanding colonial empire, and these are some of my ancestors, the communities who stayed. And so this is a map of many of the contemporary Lenape communities that exist today. There are 3 federally recognized Lenape communities in the United States, which are the Delaware Nation in Anadarko, Oklahoma, the Delaware Tribe of Indians in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, the Stockbridge-Muncie Community Band of Mohican Indians all the way up there in Wisconsin. And then you also have 2 First Nations that are recognized by the Government of Canada, and they are in Ontario. And you have Muncie Delaware Nation and Ilunapawi-Lakawit, which is their reclaiming of their own name. They were named the Delaware Nation at Moraviantown after the missionaries who came to their communities, but they have since reclaimed a name in their language, which basically translates to Delaware Nation. My communities are these 3 on the right that are centered around the Delaware Bay. So my home community being this one in the far south, the Nanticoke Indian tribe, as well as our sister communities, the Lenape Indian tribe of Delaware and the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape. I do want to highlight that there are other Lenape communities that are not represented on this map. This is a map I chose to take from my dissertation research to highlight the communities that I was actually in contact with. But I would like to also highlight the fact that there are other Lenape communities and people with Lenape affiliations that are not included on these maps. So, our language is part of a broad language family. And as I said, the Nanticoke descend from the Lenape, but so do many of the other communities who share our language family. And so shaded in orange here is the entire Algonquin language family. And you can see it's very large. It stretches across the eastern seaboard, across much of Canada, into the Great Lakes, and even further out west. And many of these communities recognize the Lenape people as the original people. And a fun story as to why it's called the Algonquin language family rather than the Lenape language family is you had some colonial linguists that came to a coastal community and asked, who are you? And they said, we're Algonquin. And they're like, okay, these are Algonquin people, they speak Algonquin. They went over to the next community and met them, and they asked them who they were and learned about their language, and they're like, huh, this language is actually very similar to the people we met before. So they're clearly in the same language family, so we're just going to title the whole language family after that first community that we met, the Algonquin language family. And that has sort of stuck today as the way that it's categorized. But many of our communities are sort of fighting to change that orientation and to highlight the fact that our histories tell us that the Lenape are sort of the trunk of that language family tree. And so there are many communities that will say that these are Lenape languages. But the languages in this family are so similar and so connected. And so for many of us who is particularly on the East Coast here, who bore the brunt of much of the early colonization and whose languages were heavily impacted, we still have the ability to lean on this language family as we are revitalizing our language. But one of the reasons why our languages are so important to learn is that they help us to reconnect with our ancestors and to reconnect with our own traditional ways of speaking and the worldviews that are embedded within them. And language provides us with the tools to recognize and create relationships with the world around us. As Nanticoke and Lenape people, we recognize much of the world around us as animate, as living beings, and our languages support and help to shape these beliefs. So in English, the animate pronouns he, she, and they are generally only reserved for humans, and sometimes our favorite animals like our pets. But then when we think about the other animals, like the squirrels or birds outside, we consider them it. As well as when we think about the trees and the flowers and the grasses and waters, we recognize that trees are alive, but we do not consider them animate, and we don't speak about them as animate grammatically in the English language. However, in Nanticoke and in Lenape, animate pronouns are used to describe people, animals, trees, water, as well as celestial bodies. And so instead of creating a hierarchy of life with humans at the top, you're creating a more balanced, equal system of relationships and recognizing that all of these beings have their own languages, their own cultures, their own rights to be and exist. And so as we're reclaiming our languages, we're also reclaiming these reciprocal relationships with these other relatives. And so today I'm really going to highlight some of the ways in which our communities are recreating and remembering and restoring these relationships with our plant relatives. And so I want to start by talking about the ihquamines, or opamenshi, which is the American chestnut tree. Ihquamines is the name in Nanticoke, and opamenshi is the name in Lenape. Now, I spent all this time saying that these languages are in the same family, and so the words are similar, but you're looking at these two words, and they look entirely different, right? But our languages are very, very descriptive. And so what's happening here is that these words are describing different aspects of the tree. So in Nanticoke, when we're saying ihquamines, we're talking about the nuts that that chestnut tree produces. And when we're talking about opamenshi, it's actually highlighting the bright white blossoms that the chestnut tree has every spring. And so that is the difference in those names. Now, this tree used to be one of the most populous trees in the eastern seaboard. I think it was the fourth most common tree. However, a fungal blight that was unknowingly imported from Asia in the early 20th century decimated the indigenous population to where they are almost completely extinct today. One of the rare survivors of the blight is located on the Coverdale Farm Preserve in northern Delaware. It's a mature tree that continues to grow and propagate in spite of its infection. And so Native Roots Farm Foundation, excuse me, NRFF for short, which is a Nanticoke-led organization that I am a part of, brought together Nanticoke and Lenape relatives from our 3 Delaware Bay sister communities to celebrate this tree relative and to renew our commitment to our collective survival and collaborative relationships. A festive atmosphere developed as we gathered together in this small pocket of Lenape. Relatives from all three tribes came together, warmly greeting each other. Laughter echoed through the forest as we hiked the short distance through the preserve to the tree. We were able to gather in fellowship around this tree, and we listened to a song that was sung by one of our relatives in celebration, and were able to call out greetings to this tree in our languages. We each offered a little bit of our water to the tree, as well as placing prayer ties of tobacco nearby. We made commitments to fight for the tree and other survivors of the blight, to advocate for healthy relationships with our non-human relatives, and to fight back against exploitation, because this tree's story mirrored our own, and it strengthened our drive to care for the land and to restore connections to the land and to our relationships with other beings. I also want to highlight another tree relative that is called the pawpaw or machikpi. Now, has anyone seen this tree growing around anywhere in New Jersey? A couple people have, all right. This is another ancient tree that we have had a very long-standing relationship with that grows in this region. It grows one of, or the largest fruit in North America, and the fruit itself actually has a bit of a tropical taste. So it's very strange to see a tree that's growing in this sort of temperate region that actually has a tropical flavor to it. The yellow creamy flesh tastes like a cross between a mango and a banana. For those of you who are familiar with custard apple and soursop in the Caribbean, it's a cousin of that tree as well. Our ancestors helped to cultivate healthy pawpaw groves, harvesting the fruits and enjoying the delicious gift, and then giving back by replanting the seeds in new spaces. See, pawpaws require cross-pollination from genetically different trees in order to bear fruit. This means that they need their seeds spread around far and wide, and the seeds must be planted fresh. They don't do well when they're dried and put into long storage like most of the other seeds that we're used to. Our ancestors cultivated reciprocal relationships with these trees, receiving the gifts of the fruit while then also spreading the seeds to help the trees to survive. The Shawnee, our neighbors to the west, even named the September moon after the pawpaw to indicate the time to harvest, highlighting their close relationship with the tree, because the fruits ripen usually in September, sometimes early October, so overlapping with the apple season pretty much. When Europeans first arrived, they didn't recognize our highly cultivated food forests and considered the land to be naturally wild and rich without human intervention. Today, pawpaws have become scarce. These ephemeral fruits have delicate flesh and short shelf lives, making them poor candidates for mass production and distribution. But pawpaws have not only become rare due to their incompatibility with the current global food systems, or not only from deforestation and development, but also because of the disruption in the reciprocal care practices. Because there continue to be many groves of pawpaw trees all over the eastern half of the United States. However, many of them never bear fruit. And so you will see these groves of many pawpaw trees all around, but those groves are containing genetically identical trees, a mother tree and her offspring. Yeah, you have a question?
Do they sucker then? Is that it?
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Yes, they sucker. So there's a mother tree and her offspring growing in close proximity to each other, spreading, but unable to produce fruits. So many Nanticoke and Lenape people living in the homelands today have never even seen a pawpaw, much less eaten one, this same fruit that was so familiar and important to their ancestors. But many of us today are looking to reconnect with this fruit and reestablish these reciprocal relationships. So NRFF has actually aided this process by reintroducing these delicious fruits, both to our Nanticoke and Lenape community members, as well as to many of the other people that are now sharing our homelands and living here today, to reintroduce everyone to these very important plants and food systems. Colonial models of conservation often emphasize the separation of humans from other species as a best practice for maintaining healthy ecosystems. However, the pawpaw rejects this model, as it is a tree that has evolved to need help to flourish. Here in New Jersey, you can still find pawpaws growing wild, so take a look on your next hike. And if you hike there in the fall, you may still be able to find a fruit here or there. And if you find that fruit, make sure to spread those seeds around so that we can keep them growing and healthy. There are many other trees and plants in our homelands that our ancestors have had close relationships with. And many of these wild medicines continue to hold teachings for us as we reacquaint ourselves with them. Our ancestors used these trees and had a long-standing relationship with them, but a lot of that knowledge has been disrupted. But the knowledge is still there in these trees, in these plants themselves, waiting to teach us again. So I'm just going to highlight 3 others, starting with the pine tree. The pine tree, which in Lenape is kuwe. With the pine tree, we can make a tea from the fresh green pine needles. And this tea contains a lot of vitamin C, which can help to ward off colds. It was also used historically to prevent or treat scurvy, which is that disease from lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. Our ancestors helped many of the new arrivals from Europe who were suffering from this disease after their long sea voyages, and we made them pine needle tea. We also will use the dried pine needles to make beautiful baskets. Particularly, not so much here in New Jersey because we're a little bit too far north, but in Delaware and further south, we love to use the needles of the loblolly pine, which if you've seen those, they have these really, really long needles. So they work really well for basket work, but you can use shorter needles too. Just gotta use a lot more of them. I also want to highlight sassafras. The sassafras tree, as you can see here, it's probably very familiar to all of you, still very much a dominant tree in our landscape today. It's one of our closest relatives that we have maintained a constant relationship with throughout our long history of colonial oppression. We make our ruby red tea from the roots of the tree, and our ancestors drank this tea, and in our communities, we still continue to drink this tea today. So one of the few plants and medicines that we've had an unbroken relationship with. And I bet all of you, even if you've never tasted sassafras tea before, I bet you already know what it tastes like. Who here has had root beer?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Root beer, the root in root beer originally comes from the root of this sassafras tree. Now, of course, today it's all artificial flavoring, but if you actually taste fresh sassafras tea, then it will uncannily taste very much like root beer. And then the last tree I want to highlight for today is cedar. And sassafras was winak. I wanted to actually say it. Sorry, I forgot that moment. And then cedar is pepohuquis. And cedar is a tree that we use in ceremony and for cleansing and neutralizing a space before we pray. When we gather any medicines, we always show respect and reciprocity to those living relatives. We'll offer tobacco or water or some other token of respect before gathering any of these medicines. We also teach that we never gather from the first plant. You'll give that offering to the first plant that you see, and then you'll leave that plant alone, and you'll go to the next one and collect the medicines from that tree. And so embedded in that practice is a concept of sustainability. We'll never take everything that is there. So these tree relatives remind us that our ancestors' knowledge is still around us, in the trees themselves, and these medicines are still available to us, and so are the teachings that they give us. And so, as I was saying, we use tobacco, which is opok in Nanticoke, and pushate in Lenape. It's tongue-tied here. And again, the words look very different because they are describing different things. Book is talking about the act of smoking this plant, right? And Kushate, is talking about a different aspect of how we are praying with the plant. But this plant is a special plant that really helps to facilitate these practices of care that I've been talking about with these plant relatives. Because as I said before, every time we go and we gather wild medicines or when we pray, we use tobacco. And even as most of our homelands and territories have been taken away and our access to tobacco limited, we've still found ways to maintain relationships with the land and with this plant. So my Uncle Herman, who's pictured here, he actually works to grow tobacco on a site that is in our former homelands, and it used to be our former reservation. Mm-hmm. This reservation is near present-day Vienna, Maryland. It's called Chacon. And it's changed hands many times since it was taken from us. So first it was a reservation for us, and then it was taken and turned into a plantation. Mm-hmm. And then today, it's actually a living history site that does educational programming. And it's called Hansel House, if you're looking it up. And so Uncle Herman has developed a relationship with the historical society that owns this land today. And he continues to grow our traditional tobacco in the fields there. And then he takes that tobacco from these fields in our homelands that we may not legally own it. However, we take that tobacco and bring it back to where our communities are today. And we're using that tobacco in ceremony and in prayers. And so we're still able to pray with these ancestral tobacco varieties that have been grown on the lands that our ancestors walked on and are still so significant and important to us. And we don't just use tobacco when we are gathering wild medicines. We also use them when we are also planting our domestic crops. So transitioning to that part of the talk, our three sisters. So there's so much ancestral knowledge in our foods and food production processes. And part of reclaiming our foods is also about reclaiming that knowledge, that history, and that health that our foods give us. It's about sovereignty, about having a control over our futures and how we interact with the world around us. And so I want to highlight some of the important cultivated plants for our communities. So I'm sure everyone here has probably heard of the concept of the three sisters, right? And so we have the corn, beans, and squash. The elder sister, corn, grows first, and she grows tall and strong and provides a trellis for the middle sister, beans, to grow up. Now the beans help to support the corn, strengthening those stalks, and also fixing nitrogen into the soil. And then the youngest sister, squash, makes her own path, sprawling along the ground, choking out weeds and keeping the soil moist. They work together to grow, and often do better together, producing a larger, healthier crop than when they're planted separately. And our people who live by the sea also used to enrich the soil by putting parts of the fish that we don't eat, like the fish heads, into the soil to help enrich it. Fertilizer. And also, these sisters don't just work together to grow more efficiently, but when we combine these three sisters, when we eat them together, they also provide a balanced set of nutrients in our bodies. Many of the foods many of our traditional foods are combinations of these different sisters. So you have a three sisters soup, or succotash, which highlights corn and beans. And together you'll get complete proteins and slow release carbs that help to regulate blood sugar levels and to keep us healthy. And so there are lessons in growing the three sisters. Lessons about holistic nutrition, not about diets, but about balance. Balance in planting, in growing, and in eating. There are lessons about community as well. When we work together, we can form stronger societies. This past summer, NRFF was able to grow a large Three Sisters garden on a 1/4-acre plot of land at the St. Andrew's School in Middletown, Delaware. We brought together Nanticoke and Lenape community members along with students and teachers at the school. And so we organized the garden. You can see that we are growing them in mounds. And so a couple of the benefits to mounds is that when you mound up the earth, the soil will warm faster so that you can plant a little bit earlier. It also helps to keep it from being compacted. The soil compacted, so it aerates in the process of making those mounds, which helps for healthy root development. And it's just also logistically helpful as you're walking through the garden to have like places to walk around that you're not stomping all over and trampling them as well. And so in this garden, we grew 2 varieties of Lenape corn, which I'll show you some pictures on the next slide. We grew a puem corn, which is a white corn that can be eaten as a sweet corn if you pick it at the correct time, or you can allow it to dry and you can grind it up into cornmeal, or you can do another process to create like hominy and grits. We also grew a Lenape blue corn as well. It's called a Lenape blue pulling corn. And through the same process. Can be eaten fresh if you pick it in the right window, and that window is a lot harder to determine. But for the most part, we allowed it to dry and grind it up into cornmeal. We also, for fun, grew some cousin corn varieties. So we grew a couple of popcorn varieties. Not from this region. We grew a glass jar popcorn variety, and then we also grew a Dakota black popcorn variety as well. And then we also brought in 3 Lenape bean varieties. So the first one being a Hannah Freeman bean, which is what I had highlighted, just going back to the previous slide. That's the beans represented here. This is the blue corn, and this is Nanticoke squash. So the 3 bean varieties being these Hannah Freeman beans, which you can see are kind of a speckled brown, as well as a blue Shakamaxon and a purple King Sesson, which are both, they look like black beans. They're dark beans. And we grew 2 varieties of Nanticoke squash. We grew Maycock squash, which is a summer squash, as well as Nanticoke winter squash. And the word Maycock is actually an English version of our Nanticoke word for squash, which is macaque. So Maycock, macaque. That's our word for squash. So it's still there, so the language is still there in the names. And we also added a 4th sister, sunflowers. And sunflowers have often been grown with alongside these 3 sisters, and particularly providing a we're going to call it a wall, a wall around. So we grew them around the perimeter of the garden as one small way to help protect our corn crop inside, because corn pollinates through the air. And it can pollinate up to a mile or 2. And in Delaware in particular, there is a lot of commercial corn being grown in the region, GMO corn. And so when we are trying to grow our heirloom variety corn, we are having to sort of compete and trying to protect it from being pollinated from all the GMO corn that's surrounding it. And so this year, we're going to try to time it differently, so we're going to try to plant earlier, weather permitting, so that we can get ours in before the GMO crop starts. But another way is to create these natural barriers. So planting sunflowers, if we had access to the land, we could plant trees as a border as well, particularly like sap-heavy trees that would kind of, the corn pollen comes through and it gets sticky, and so it catches some of that. But since this isn't land that we have, we can't plant trees on this land that we have, so we're looking at other possibilities. But I also want to talk a little bit more in depth about elder sister corn. So these are the 2 corn varieties that we grew. You can see this is what the puem corn looks like fresh. And it's got, if you can see this little tip on the end, this is a fungus that grows on the corn. In Mexico they call it huitlacoche. It's been called corn truffles. It's got lots of different names. It's actually edible. Tastes kind of like a mushroom, a little bit, sort of like a corn-flavored mushroom, basically, is what it tastes like. And so, you know, just highlighting many different things that are coming out of these fields. And then this is our Lenape blue corn. But in addition to needing a wide space to avoid cross-pollination, corn also needs approximately 100 plants or so to reach a stable and successful genetic diversity. So it grows best when it's grown in community. And so we need our land back to successfully grow these foods and to nourish our future generations. Many of us only have small, separate family plots of land on which to grow our gardens. We only have space for a small number of corn plants each year. And even though we're only able to grow these plants in small quantities, we're still able to come together and share those seeds and mix those seeds to help to create stronger genetic diversity in the corn population for future generations. And it's more than one family can sustain alone. And so corn reminds us that we need to rely on each other to ensure a stronger future for all of us. There are also teachings embedded in harvesting and seed saving practices as well. The middle of the corn has the best kernels, and those are the ones that we collect and save for seed, whereas the outer kernels are generally processed for eating. And so this simple practice is really embedded with ancestral knowledge and ideologies. The idea of saving the best parts for the future, rather than the instant gratification of eating the best immediately, are an embodied form of care that growing our food teaches us. And then I want to highlight our Lenape squash. Lenape squash, which has been named after our people and cultivated by our communities for many generations, until the violence of colonialism severed our connections to each other. Thanks to the efforts of seed activists, however, such as the Experimental Farm Network, the Lenape squash is returning home. For the last few years, NRFF has helped to distribute Lenape squash seedlings to community members to grow at home, helping them to reconnect with these ancestors. Lenape squash defies standardization. Each seed is capable of generating a variety of different colored squash with their own range of flavors and textures. So you can see here, every single one of these is a Lenape squash. And some of them, they could be orange, green, pink, yellow. Some of them are warty, some of them are smooth, some of them are pumpkin shaped, some of them have turbans, some of them are elongated. And each seed, even if you save a seed from this pink one here, you could end up with a green or orange one or something else. So the genetic diversity, you never know what you're going to get. And they carry the memories of when squash and other vegetables were able to flourish in their diversity before the advent of monocrop culture and standardization that we see today. When we see today, most of the squash that we buy a butternut squash. We know exactly what it's going to look like and what it's going to taste like, you know? There's a little bit of variation here, but it's been very standardized, which as Lenape squash, even in the flavors and the textures inside, are very, very different. Every single one I've had tastes different. And so we're continuing to try to keep this genetic diversity alive and celebrate these survivors who refuse to be colonized.
That's right.
I also want to highlight a really important companion that we have in our celebration of squash, because it's not just our human relationships with squash. There's another member of this, or squash's relationship with corn and beans, but there's another relationship that I want to add in, and that is the squash bee. So squashes have, they have imperfect flowers. They can't pollinate themselves. And so we have squash bees that do this. Now, squash bees originated alongside squash in Central America and in the Southwest region. And the squash bees traveled with the spread of the squash. As people moved the squash itself north and east, the bees came along on their own. And they are the only known pollinators to spread their range and follow a plant in response to domestication and agriculture that have not been intentionally introduced by humans. Just a little fun fact. And you might be able to tell by the name, but squash bees only pollinate flowers in the curbit family. So they'll pollinate squash, pumpkins, zucchinis, melons, cucumbers. And the interconnectedness of them continues. So squash flowers open very, very early in the morning. And these bees are out half an hour or more before sunrise. So these bees are up earlier than many other types of bees. So they are consuming squash nectar exclusively while all the other bees are sleeping in. And during this early morning feast, they'll collect the squash pollen from the male squash flowers and transfer it to the female squash flowers to pollinate them. And because of this early schedule, it makes it so other pollinators, other types of bees and other forms of pollinators, they don't actually have the opportunity to pollinate. So these are when they say the early bird gets the worm, maybe it's the squash bee gets the squash. Another fun fact about these bees is they spend a lot of their lives within the flowers. So squash bees will mate in squash flowers, and many male squash bees will sleep overnight in the flowers as well. And female squash bees feed their offspring pollen and nectar from the squash plants. And so they continue to have a very strongly connected relationship. And we celebrate that and celebrating this plant relative, or this animal relative. And in spite of the drought that we had last summer, our Three Sisters garden actually thrived, particularly the corn and beans. The squash had a harder time because they're the last sister to be planted, so they actually got planted right at the beginning when the drought started. But we ended up replanting them a little bit later after we gotten some rainfall, and they were able to do really well from there. And looking at some of the other gardens that we were cultivating, ones that weren't with these native plants, we could really see the difference in how these gardens were thriving, because many of our other gardens were really, really struggling this past summer, really struggling with the drought conditions. But these corn and these beans and these squash, you could tell that they were happy to be planted in their homelands, and they thrived in this space. And we even were able to receive a beautiful visualization of their happiness, where one of the sunflowers that we planted in the garden actually bloomed in the shape of a heart. And I have a picture of that on the last slide. But it was just a really beautiful surprise to see in that garden. And so we had many members of our community being able to come at different times in the season to cultivate these plants and to harvest them and to see them in all stages of their life and to reconnect with these plant relatives. And when it came time to harvest all of these relatives, we harvested so many mounds of blue corn, and then we were able to dry and grind that corn into cornmeal that we've been able to share all across our community. And these bags of cornmeal pictured here, we aren't just sharing them with our local Nanticoke and Lenape communities, but they've actually been traveling to those other Lenape communities, of communities who were pushed outwards. So if you remember my map from the beginning, some of these bags ended up going all the way out to Wisconsin. Some even made it across the border into Canada. And the seeds that we used to plant this corn harvest with, those seeds had actually been selected 2 years prior, when we had a gathering of all those displaced relatives to come home to New Jersey and to harvest a set of corn at Princeton University that they were growing for us for seed. And so all of these Lenape community members that were coming from Canada and Wisconsin and other places came together to save the center of each of those ears of seeds. And and it's from those seeds that we grew this garden this past summer, and then ground that corn into cornmeal, and then we're able to re-gift these bags of cornmeal back to those same people, those same community members. And so this has been a process of really helping us to celebrate and strengthen our ties across the diaspora and across our homelands with all of our relatives. And it's helped us to come together as we celebrate our languages and our histories. We always love to celebrate with our foods. And these foods and foodways continue to connect us as relatives across Turtle Island. But I can't finish without highlighting another important relative, and that is our relative water. Because as Nanticoke and Lenape people, we understand that water is not merely a resource. Water is life. Water is alive. She has memory. And long before Elsa from Frozen sang about it, we've always known that water carries memories. And at that same gathering where our relatives were also saving these seeds, it was an opportunity for them to reconnect with ancestral waterways that they had been displaced from. And so we were able to step into the water and together and reconnect ourselves with these waterways and remember these important relationships. These waters remember our ancestors, and they'll remember us too. Every October, I take part in a water ceremony on Randall's Island in New York City as part of Indigenous Peoples Day weekend. And during that ceremony, people from Lenape cousin communities, as well as from many other places, all bring water from their homelands. And we pour that water into the East River and the Harlem River as a reminder that all the waters of the world are connected. And we said, as we poured these waters, we said prayers for healthy relationships, for cleaner water, for cleaner ecosystems. Because every being on the planet needs clean water. This fight is not just a human fight. It's also a chance to advocate for the return of respectful and reciprocal relationships with the living world, the plants, the animals, and the waters. And as we were in the garden last summer, that drought was really reminding us, how important this water is. Water, in Nanticoke, the word is nip. In Lenape, it's mbi. In the root word, it's nubi, and that's where it's similar. And then lastly, I just want to highlight that revitalizing our languages really helps us to strengthen that connection to our ancestors and their worldviews. It strengthens our relationships with our non-human relatives, whether they be trees or bees, squash or water. Learning our languages helps to work to heal the trauma of genocide and to fight back against the continued marginalization of our communities. And I just want to highlight that we've been bringing our language back, and we've published a children's language book. We are starting to offer community language lessons within our community. Eventually, soon, in the very near future, we will be launching a language website and continuing to learn, as we learn our language, to learn more about our plant relatives, learn more ways to connect with each other and all of our relations, our ilongo makik. So, wanishi. And here's the hearts of flowers.